Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I think someone's trying to tell me something. All right. No, I'm double fisting. Thanks for coming today. We've had a really busy day here at the center, so if you've been here, I'm glad you stuck around. We are so fortunate to have Anthony Sammarco back with us today. I know some of you have been to some of his other talks. He is a very well-known Boston historian and author, and today, very timely presentation, Thanksgiving traditions in Boston. Thanksgiving is 2 weeks from today, if you can believe it. So, Anthony, thank you.
I'll hold it, it's easier. I want to thank you, actually, for inviting me, but boy, what a day. Thank you for actually coming out in the rain. But I think in a lot of ways when we think of holidays, I mean, Thanksgiving is one of those holidays that we visit with family and friends, and it's a wonderful turkey. But I think in a lot of ways, maybe like you, my family was both English and Irish and Italian. So there was always pasta as well as antipasto, followed by the turkey. One uncle didn't eat anything other than roast beef, and my sister never ate anything other than ham. So it was truly a feast. I was perfectly content with roast turkey. But this is one of these books that I've been writing in what's called the Traditions in Boston. So I started this series on Christmas. Not only do we celebrate Christmas, but you might remember, of course, the enchanted village of St. Nicholas, the Boston Common with the nativity creche and the lights. And the whole idea was, in some ways, that it shows how much we share in our memories. Subsequently, I've done one on Valentine's Day, Easter, Halloween, and, of course, Thanksgiving. So the next one is July 4th, or Independence Day. But Thanksgiving is something in a lot of ways that really is something that gives thanks. And what it was a profitable harvest in 1621. Seen here, the pilgrims would actually celebrate, not only with probably a turkey, but a haunch of venison and all sorts of different foods from the sea. But Thanksgiving is something in some ways that I actually dedicate this book to a woman named Sarah Josepha Buell Hale. Now, seen here in a silhouette, she was not only a widow, but she had to support her 4 children. And she went on to become the editor of the Godey's Ladies book. It was a major magazine that was read by women across the country. And she did that for 40 years. But she advocated for her entire life until Abraham Lincoln appointed a holiday, which would be the 4th Thursday of the month of November, as the American holiday. It was the only second holiday that the country actually declared. Independence Day and George Washington's birthday, which unfortunately we don't celebrate, though I always have cherry pie. She was the mother of the American Thanksgiving, and she wrote about it as something that not only talked about the pilgrim culture, but also how basically it was changing. Of course, in the 19th century, we saw tremendous numbers of new Bostonians, people from all over the world coming to actually contribute to the development of the city. Well, Noah Webster once described Thanksgiving as the act of rendering thanks or expressing gratitude for favors or mercies. And Thanksgiving has been celebrated nationally off and on since 1789, with a proclamation by George Washington after a request by Congress. In the 19th century, there were really only 2 national holidays, Washington's birthday and Independence Day. It seemed that only New Englanders celebrated Thanksgiving, and each of the 6 states scheduled its own date to celebrate from October to January. Over the years, various governors of Massachusetts would proclaim a holiday of Thanksgiving, but it was under the presidency of Abraham Lincoln that Thanksgiving became a federal holiday in 1863 during the American Civil War. Lincoln proclaimed a national day of thanksgiving and praise for our beneficent Father who dwelleth in the heavens, to be celebrated on the last Thursday of November. However, by the time of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, prompted by a series of editorials written by Sarah Josepha Hale, proclaimed a National Thanksgiving Day to be celebrated on the 26th, the final Thursday of November, 1863. Sarah Hale was the author of the popular nursery rhyme, Mary Had a Little Lamb, and known for her lifelong quest to establish Thanksgiving as an American holiday. However, her career for over 4 decades was as the editor of Godey's Ladies' Book, a journal that profoundly shaped trends in taste, fashion, and design in the 19th century. And in her book, Northwood, Life North and South, Sarah Hale describes Thanksgiving dinner. She said that it was a long table covered in a white damask tablecloth. Every child had a seat at the table. The more the better, it being considered an honor for a man to sit down to his Thanksgiving dinner surrounded by a large family. With the feast composed of a leg of pork, loin of mutton, sirloin of beef, vegetables, gravy, a goose, ducklings, pickles, preserves, a chicken pie, and the celebrated pumpkin pie, an indispensable part of a good and true Yankee Thanksgiving. Well, the whole aspect of Thanksgiving was thanks to the Pilgrims. Now, the Pilgrims were known as separatists. They were people from England who did not join the Church of England, unlike the Puritans who settled Massachusetts Bay Colony, who were members of the Church of England, but became someone who wanted to purify it from within. The separatists were harried out of England by the king, and as a result, the Pilgrims would settle in Plymouth, in what became known as Plymouth Bay Colony. Well, during the 19th century, the cult of the Pilgrims took place with paintings and etchings and stories. And seen here is a painting, The Landing of the Pilgrims, painted by Henry Bacon, which depicts Mary Chilton stepping ashore on Plymouth Rock. It's a depiction. She was not the first to step on Plymouth Rock. But during that period, it was King James, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, who in 1603 succeeded Elizabeth I as the last Tudor monarch of England and Ireland, who had died childless. He continued to reign in all 3 kingdoms, Scotland, England, Wales, and Ireland, and after the union of crowns, he based himself in England. In this portrait, after John de Cleets, painted in 1606, he was depicted as not just an absolute ruler, but a fashionable dandy. In that instance, the Pilgrim Fathers, seen here boarding the Mayflower, in a painting by Bernard Gribble, a noted British marine artist. The Mayflower set sail from Plymouth on September 16, 1620, and is seen at anchor in Plymouth Harbor as rowboats bring the passengers from shore to the ship, along with provisions seen in the foreground before its departure. This is probably a harrowing time. People knew they were crossing the Atlantic Ocean. They'd never see family or friends again. And in that instance, they were separating themselves from the culture of England, but they were creating something that was a new Zion in the New World. When they reached the New World, they stopped at Provincetown, and seen here, they would actually sign the Mayflower Compact. This is a painting by Jean Ferris, done in 1899, and it shows William Bradford, seated on the right with a dark hat and a ruff, depicted signing the Mayflower Compact in a common room on the ship Mayflower. The Mayflower Compact created laws for Mayflower pilgrims and non-pilgrims alike for the good of their new colony. And within a short period of time, the Mayflower would then take them from Race Point in Provincetown directly across what is today Cape Cod Bay to Plymouth. And in that instance, in 1620, this was the first true settlement in New England. It brought people in such a way to the New World so they could practice their own way of worship, whatever it was. And seen here in a fanciful drawing of the shallop of passengers making landfall at Plymouth Harbor, it was on December 21st, 1620. I don't think any of us would want to go somewhere that was totally barren of land, houses, and anything in December. But seen here, the legend asserts that after Mary Chilton, John Alden was purportedly the second person to set foot on the rocky landscape, following a harrowing and stormy journey from the Mayflower. These people arrived, and of course they were met by Massasoit. He was the sachem, or leader of the Wampanoag Confederacy. The term Massasoit means great sachem, or chief. Massasoit forged critical political and personal ties with colonial leaders, with William Bradford, Edward Winslow, Stephen Hopkins, John Carver, and Miles Standish, ties which grew out of a negotiated peace treaty on March 22nd, 1621. Massasoit, who spoke English, by the way, was said to be humane and honest, never violated his word, and was constantly endeavored to imbue his people with a love of not only justice, but of fellow man. The statue, which was done by Cyrus Dallin, stands on Pilgrim Hill in Plymouth. And of course, because they were religious, and because they did establish a meeting house, it was not a church, but a meeting house, they would actually be going on church, as it says here, pilgrims going to church on Sunday, not only led, but followed by men with blunderbusses. And even though Broughton, the artist, had grown up in America, he was born in England and spent most of his career working in England. However, he became very well known for painting scenes of early history in the American colonies. During this period, many of the pilgrims would die, not only because it was exposure during the winter months, they had no real shelter. At least half of the pilgrims would die, and only 4 women would survive. But they had a profitable harvest in 1621, and it is thought that here, this painting, The First Thanksgiving, painted by Jenny Brownscombe in 1914, depicts the first Thanksgiving. Seated at a long table, not only do we see the pilgrims, but we also see Native Americans. It's a good example in some ways of how we basically began to interpret this of pilgrim culture. And this reached a wide audience and influenced the national understanding when this was printed in Life magazine. The whole culture of Thanksgiving was to give thanks. Was it the harvest or the fact that one had survived? But in this instance, the pilgrims themselves would have lived, as we see here, on a street that had been created and houses that were built in something that we would really realize was the wilderness in 1620. Well, this is Plymouth Plantation, and this was founded by Henry Hornblower II. He got his wealth through the investment house of Hornblower and Weeks in Boston. They were a major investment house. And he was fascinated with the Pilgrim story and archaeology, including early American Indian sites, and opened the first colonial exhibit, called The First House, on the Plymouth waterfront in 1949. Eventually, a meeting house was built, and they were eventually moved to this area that became Plymouth Plantation. But you can see Plymouth Harbor in the distance, and these small one-room houses that the Pilgrims began in some ways to actually live in. Well, the first house was the interpretation of the architect Charles Rutten Strickland, the way he thought this probably looked, which eventually proved to be untrue. But it was built in 1948 on Water Street in Plymouth to attract attention for the proposed Plymouth Plantation. The small thatched roof wood house was an immediate success, with 300,000 visitors by 1949. And seen here is Spencer Brewster with his rifle and a turkey slung over his shoulder, approaching the house with his wife Marietta Withington Brewster and their children Anne, Marley, and Spencer playing in the foreground. They did live in Plymouth, but they would reenact, as we would realize, this aspect of the Plymouth Plantation. And it was an important feature to realize that they even roasted the turkey over an open fire. Now, this photograph was taken about 1950, and it shows Spencer Brewster at the head of the table carving the turkey. All of the children and his wife are dressed as pilgrims come to life. But the man on the ground, who is a Native American, doesn't have Massachusetts Indian headdress. This is the Sioux headdress. So it was a total misconception, but it looked good. Well, the whole idea here that they would also build the old fort, and this was actually something that one might realize was necessary in the 1620s. who knew what would happen? Would the Native Americans rise in contempt, or would the various animals in the woods actually come? But the fort was built in 1953 on Water Street, just south of Plymouth Rock. And in 1958, the fort was moved to the Eel River site where Plymouth Plantation is now located. The land was the gift of Harriet Wood Hornblower, the widow of Henry Hornblower, whose summer house was on the site since being acquired by the family in 1898, and it encompassed 107 acres. In that instance, during Plymouth Plantation's interpretation, and this is a postcard from 1960, we saw not just reenactors as pilgrims, but also the Massachusetts and Wampanoag Indians. This is the English village section of the museum, and reenactors have been trained to speak, act, and dress appropriately for the period. And seen here in the early 1960s, Pilgrim and Wampanoag reenactors recreate a bountiful harvest as a dinner of Thanksgiving. Each of these people speak in the first person and will answer questions from the visitors while discussing their lives and participating in tasks such as cooking, planting, blacksmithing, and animal husbandry. Has anybody visited Pilgrim Plantation? Well, I love it, I think, in a lot of ways, and of course I ask very odd questions, trying to get them to come out of character. But they always say, "I don't understand you." I said, well, I guess it's at home as well as here. But in his Thanksgiving proclamation in 1863, Abraham Lincoln said that the year is drawing to its close as amid filled with the blessings of fruitful fields and healthful skies. To these bounties, which are so constantly enjoyed that we are prone to forget the source from which they come, others have been added which are of so extraordinary a nature that they cannot fail to penetrate and soften even the heart which is habitually insensible to the everyday life. Lincoln was truly a very good man, and he saw this as something thanks to Sarah Josepha Hale. Well, seen here as an elderly woman, she was well aware of the power of the written word, and she used it to the best possible advantage. She was the editor of Godey's Ladies' Book, and one of the most widely read publications in the United States during the 19th century, and often extolled and wrote articles in the journal on the importance of creating a national holiday to celebrate Thanksgiving, hopefully uniting one great family republic. And it did happen. But in that instance, many people in the 19th century began to actually take the Pilgrim culture to a new extreme. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, a very well-known writer, poet, and educator who had taught both at Bowdoin and Harvard, and whose book The Courtship of Miles Standish and Other Poems was published in 1858 and became a bestseller, ironically, not only here, but as well as in London. We realize in some ways Miles Standish was brought to life in this poem. And of course we know the instance with Priscilla Mullen and John Alden. But there was also Lydia Maria Child. Has anybody ever heard of this woman? I think you'll be surprised. She was the daughter of Converse and Susanna Rand Francis, and was born in Medford Square, where in 1797 her father first baked the famous Medford crackers. They were pilot crackers. Child was an ardent abolitionist, women's rights advocate, novelist, and journalist, and a noted prolific author. Her best-selling book was The Frugal Housewife, dedicated to those who are not ashamed of economy, which was published in 1829. But she also wrote a poem that was actually made into a song, the New England Boy Song about Thanksgiving Day. Over the river and through the wood, to grandfather's house we go. The horse knows the way to carry the sleigh through the white and drifted snow. Over the river and through the wood, to grandfather's house away. We would not stop for doll or top, for it is Thanksgiving Day. Now do you know Lydia Maria Child? It's a fun thing, but it's also the fact, how do you like white and drifted snow? There were a few Thanksgivings I remember with snow, not recently, but we're talking a few years ago. There was also the fact that Currier and Ives would actually begin to do these pictures of home. Many people in the 19th century were moving not only to the Midwest, but even the far West. And home to Thanksgiving was a nostalgic look at the old homestead at Thanksgiving. And this was depicted by a man by the name of John Schulfer after a painting done by George Dorey, whose rural winter scenes became popular when reproduced as lithographic prints by Currier and Ives. The nostalgic scene was printed by Currier and Ives in 1867. This print features a lovely snow-covered setting with a young man who has just arrived home in a horse-drawn sleigh, greeted by his family on the porch of a modest farmhouse. The idea of family and Thanksgiving became synonymous, and here in a print, Thanksgiving Day, the arrival at the old home, was engraved by Winslow Homer and was published in Harper's Weekly on November 27th of 1858. A couple with their children alight from the carriage to be warmly greeted at the old home, with its memories of past Thanksgivings becoming a new one on that day. Thanksgiving in the 19th century had come to be known as a holiday of family and friends, new and old, sharing the joy of the season. And of course, the star of the day was the wild turkey. And this is a print that was done by John James Audubon, and this appeared at plate number 1 in his monumental book, The Birds of America. And since the time of the Pilgrims, the wild turkey has proliferated in America, and in his book, by attempting to paint one page each day and painting with the newly discovered technique, Audubon paid homage to the noble wild turkey that became synonymous with Thanksgiving. I have a house in Austerville, and one of the aspects is we have wild turkeys roaming Cape Cod. But we keep chickens, and we have a dog and a cat. So the dog and the cat and the chickens always play together. But when the turkeys come into the garden, they begin to look, who are these people? But the turkeys have a great affinity for the chickens. But seen here is Thanksgiving dinner, the dinner. And it was engraved by Winslow Homer, was published in Harper's Weekly in November 27th, 1858. As father carves the roast turkey and guests clink wine glasses in a toast to Thanksgiving, notice the children's table on the right, an age-old rite of passage where they would be seated until they were old enough to sit with the adults. But dinner was also something in some ways that we realized not everybody was a descendant of the Pilgrims. By the 1840s, Boston was beginning to become a very diverse place. The potato famine in Ireland brought the Irish. We would see Russian Jews, German Jews, as well as Italians. And this first Thanksgiving dinner was a print done by William Jewett and published in 1868 in Harper's Weekly. The young immigrant girl, on the left, in a dark dress and headscarf, sits at the dining room table enjoying her first taste of turkey. The young daughter with her father seated on the left and her mother standing at the table is dressed in contrasting white to the dark dress of the immigrant child. And as the United States became more urban and family members began to live further apart, Thanksgiving was to become a time for family to gather. And the holiday moved away from its religious roots, from the Pilgrims, to allow immigrants of every background to assimilate. And this was when we introduced our foods into what became Thanksgiving dinner, always with turkey, but with a variety of other things. And even here, Uncle Sam's Thanksgiving Dinner was published in November 20th of 1869 in Harper's Weekly. Uncle Sam is seen on the right, standing at the head of the dining room table and in front of a large painting of the Immigrant Center, Castle Garden in New York, and is carving a turkey for representatives of the diverse immigration that was taking place in the decades after the Civil War. Native Americans, African, Chinese, Irish, German, French, Spanish, Arab, and Italian. Thomas Nast, a political cartoonist, idealizes dinner into an all-inclusive American feast with Columbia, seen on the left, the symbol of America, seated between an African man and a Chinese man. So now Thanksgiving dinner was, yes, giving thanks, but it was a much broader sense of what America was about. And in some ways, many people enjoyed dinner, but in the 19th century began to send greeting cards for Thanksgiving. Well, this is Louis Prang, and he's considered the father of the Christmas card, as in 1874 he published the first American Christmas card in Boston, though they have been known in England since 1842. A native of Breslau, Germany, he was not only to produce Christmas cards in the United States, but it was said, even during his successful career, that his cards had an individual charm, not merely in design, but in technique, lettering, the stock used, and their almost perfect coloring. Well, he did Christmas, but he began doing Thanksgiving cards in 1886, and this was his first Thanksgiving card. It doesn't look very Thanksgiving to me. It says, "A cheerful Thanksgiving to you." And we see a bunch of pears. It says, "A bundle of great pears, bell-shaped and streaky, some rich orchard's pride." Well, it's nice to get a card, but the idea was he also made some that were really quite outre. And seeing here, this design of Louis Prang's Christmas card was decidedly odd, with a turkey hen and her poults surrounding a pie from which a screaming child's heads and hands emerge. And it says, "Enjoy and well digest Thanksgiving bliss, else you'll be troubled by a dream like this." I like that card. But you began to see it wasn't just greeting cards, but even magazines, such as This Thanksgiving 1648, depicted by Joseph Christian Ledersecker, one of the preeminent American illustrators of the 20th century, in the November 20th, 1940 edition of the American Weekly. The Pilgrim Father stands at the center as the family gives thanks before enjoying their roast turkey dinner. But the boy on the right, with his blonde, bowl-cut hair, glances up with more interest in the impending feast than in the prayer. And here, grandmother, in an illustration by Norman Rockwell, on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post on November 23rd, 1935. That little boy could be any one of us, looking up at our mother, our grandmother, or one of our aunts, and realizing that cutting that crust off of the pie, when it's baked, it again is made with love. And here, a bespectacled woman beams as this Norman Rockwell painting as she holds a platter with a roast turkey with the word Thanksgiving, almost creating a halo around her head. She'd be a saint in my book if she cooked for me. Titled Thanksgiving, it was published in the Literary Digest in 1919. But the most iconic one was Freedom from Want. And this was one of Norman Rockwell's most iconic paintings, part of the Four Freedom series, and with an elderly couple standing at the head of the dining room table as a roast turkey is placed on the table to be carved. Norman Rockwell used his own Vermont dining room as the backdrop of this famous painting, and he enlisted family members and neighbors to join the table as models, including his cook, Mrs. Thaddeus Wheaton, who was depicted serving the turkey. It was the idea of turkey, family, friends, a damask tablecloth, just like Josepha Hale had said. But of course, most of us, and me, eat far too much, and we've created the sin of gluttony. I always had a great aunt who would always say, "I've committed gluttony." It was without fail at the end of the meal. But here we have a pilgrim, thanks to Norman Rockwell, sitting in the stocks. Well, at least we could sit on the sofa. And seeing here these two children in the 1950s dressed as pilgrims, the tune is, "My turkey, 'tis of thee, sweet bird of cranberry, of thee I sing. I love thy breast and wings, back, legs, and other things. I love thy good stuffing, O luscious bird." It's charming, but it's also something you began to realize many of us dressed like this in school as children. So whether we descended from the Puritans or our families were descended from immigrants, we became Americans on Thanksgiving Day. Well, most of us had to buy a turkey, and I know you're all too young, but when I was a child, turkeys were fresh. They were not frozen. I can remember my grandfather standing in the kitchen, singeing the quills from the turkey, the most horrible smell imaginable. But seeing here a thresher and Kelly who sold poultry at Quincy Market, before it became a tourist attraction, actually had all of these freshly killed turkeys. They're upside down and they've got wax paper on their throats so it didn't bleed onto the person's clothes as they carried it home. But the mother and her children look at, of course, the biggest turkey they could find, but this was far more intense in a preparation than what we know today. And in some ways, even Julia Child would make it look easy. Well, Julia Child was the well-known chef that, through her cooking show, The French Chef, on WGBH television, taught Bostonians not only how to cook à la Française, but how to enjoy the process and entertain family and friends with well-prepared gourmet dinners. Here she holds a turkey by its legs as she prepares it to be roasted for Thanksgiving dinner. It was thanks to her culinary skills that Bostonians' gastronomic delights and pleasure in eating are worthwhile. And in that instance, seen here in the 1950s, the mother of the house getting up at 5 a.m., prepare the turkey, stuff it, and of course season everything. But basically it would take 5 or 6 hours to roast. Creates in some instances something that took 7 hours to prepare, 15 minutes to eat, and 5 hours to clean up. And of course, look at these children. Wouldn't we ooh and ah as grandmother actually bastes the turkey? It looks wonderful, but it looks just like our families too. So Thanksgiving is much more than just a holiday. It's something that's ingrained in our minds. And seen here, this young child covetously looks at that turkey. His grandfather catches his eye. But I love it as they say their prayer, because not only do you see this wonderful turkey, but you see a glass of celery. Celery was always put into ice water to keep it crisp. My mother would always serve a celery tray. So there was celery, because my father was Italian, finucchi, which was the Italian celery, and olives. Nobody ate it, but it was always on the table. But in that instance, here this child with her tongue at the ready watches as her father carves the roast turkey. And the bountiful harvest, sliced tomatoes, not something everyone uses, potatoes. We see pumpkins, gourds, and even pine cones. This was truly a holiday, and it was a feast. Children loved it, but so too did adults. And here, these two very well-dressed children sit down to Thanksgiving dinner, admiring a huge roast turkey ready to be carved, along with the obligatory glass tray of canned jellied cranberry sauce. Ocean Spray says that the first commercial cranberry sauce was canned in 1912 by Marcus Uran, who owned cranberry bogs in Hanson, Massachusetts. Uran developed cranberry juice cocktail in 1933, and later created a syrup for mixed drinks. And the famous canned cranberry sauce log we know today became available nationwide in 1941. And though I do serve homemade cranberry sauce, I feel almost naked without a tray of canned cranberry sauce. And we realize that many of us vie for the turkey wishbone, hoping to make a wish as we break it with family member or a friend. And seen here in the 1930s, Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney hold a larger-than-life turkey wishbone for probably a larger-than-life wish. But the whole idea is, in some ways, when I was doing this book, I was astonished to find out that Boston had a Thanksgiving Day parade. Now, every Thanksgiving morning, I stand in the dining room as I watch the television in the living room, a martini in one hand and patting the dog in the other, watching the Macy's Day Parade. I love it. But between 1929 and 1943, there was a Thanksgiving Day Parade in Boston. Well, the annual Thanksgiving Day Parade was a lavish one sponsored by the Jordan Marsh department store. And seen here is the two acrobats balloon, which actually has a flated derriere, that was designed by Rudolph Lopes and flown in the 1939 parade. The balloon floats by the reviewing stand that was located in front of the Massachusetts State House on Beacon Hill just before it was guided down Park and Winter Streets to Jordan Marsh. Well, this was something that we realized Edward Richardson Mitten, president of Jordan Marsh, did this because of the beginning of the Great Depression. October of 1929, we saw the stock market crash, and he thought that a parade might lift the aspect of people's spirits. Well, he did have wonderful balloons, some which were actually remnants from the Macy's Day Parade. Does anybody know who this is? Well, Mickey Mouse was not only a 4-story high balloon, but he was held by guide wires. And if you look at the base of the balloon, they have men and women dressed as mice. And they would hold it because if they let go, the balloon would ascend into the heavens. Well, this was something that would go from Kenmore Square in Boston along Beacon Street to the State House, and then down Park and Winter Street to Jordan Marsh. It was said that the height of the war between 1941 and 1943, over 90,000 Bostonians would line the street of Beacon Street to see the parade. And even here, with Thanksgiving Day Parade in 1931, was a massive one, and of course it advertised as heralding the impending arrival of the Yuletide season. The Porky Pig balloon, with a broad smile and red star in his chest, waddles along Beacon Street with rope handlers dressed in fanciful costumes as Chinese, Arabians, and Celts, replete with spear and circular shields, as well as clowns. Porky Pig began in 1935 as an animated character in the Warner Brothers production of Looney Tunes. Look at the number of people. And here, the Big Bad Wolf balloon was inspired by Walt Disney's movie The Three Little Pigs, and we all know what they did to them. This was something in some ways that the Big Bad Wolf and the Three Pigs, which made their first comics appearance in the Silly Symphony Sunday half pages prior to the release of the cartoon sequel. But I think my favorite is this one. Not only do we see Felix the cat, but in the foreground we see this disembodied head on a rolling platform with a massive nose and wide ears as a veritable freak show of an oddball balloon creature. I think it looks like Mr. Bean, who is the English comedian. And we see as it's rolled up Beacon Street, followed by Felix the cat, with his black body, white eyes, and giant grin, coupled with the surrealism of the situations in which his character places him, combined to make Felix one of the most recognized cartoon characters in film history. And I think basically the two-headed giant balloon was something that was incredible. Again, 4 stories in height. Not only did this balloon have 2 heads that seemed to look in both directions at once, replete with pierced ears, head bandanas, and a spiked mace in the left hand. It had flown in Macy's New York Thanksgiving Day Parade in 1936, and is seen here the next year in Boston. This was something that really was a great attraction, but it was ended in 1943. The war effort needed the silk that was the balloons were made from for the war effort for parachutes, and the helium was necessary as well. It was discontinued, but it was a fond memory for many Bostonians. But when we think about Thanksgiving, probably our minds go back to Plymouth and Plymouth Rock. Well, this baldacchino, which was built by Hammett Billings, a very well-known Boston architect, covered the original Plymouth Rock. Of course, it was only a third of the size because many Bostonians chipped away at it to take home a piece of Plymouth Rock. But by the period of the 1880s, this whole concept of the Pilgrim culture was very important. Many people looked at Plymouth Rock, where married children purportedly stepped upon, as the place where we finally saw the English settling in the New World. Well, today it's a much larger monument built in 1920, but the whole concept is Plymouth Rock has become the icon. We saw not just the rock being preserved, but new buildings. Even this, the monument to the Pilgrim forefathers, was also designed by Hammett Billings and begun in 1859 and was probably his best-known design. An 83-foot-high granite base supports a 36-foot colossal figure of faith, which held a Bible in one hand and pointed towards the heavens in the other. It still stands in Plymouth, and it's a great example of something to the Pilgrim forefathers. But there's also the Pilgrim Monument that was built between 1907 and 1910 in Provincetown, Massachusetts, to commemorate the first landing of the Mayflower Pilgrims. This granite came from Stonington, Maine, and each stone is the thickness of a wall. The architect was Willard Sears, who designed the tower emulating the Torre del Mangia and the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena, Italy. I was there last year and I made sure that I checked everything out, and yes, it did look just like it. But Willard Sears was also the architect of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, a major architect. Well, it was dedicated in a Masonic rite, and seen here, the laying of the cornerstone for the Pilgrim Monument was done in 1907, and dignitaries would arrive from Boston by boat from Boston. On the far right is Joseph Henry Sears, president of the Cape Cod Pilgrim Memorial Association, leaning over to speak with President Theodore Roosevelt. And seated in front of the flag-draped cornerstone, are on the left John Lewis Bates, Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, United States Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, and President Theodore Roosevelt, and Governor Curtis Guile. In this instance, it wasn't just a monument, it was also, during the mid-1950s, a recreation of the Mayflower. It was built of English oak timbers with hand-sewn canvas sails, and the Mayflower took 55 days to cross the Atlantic Ocean, arriving on June 12, 1957 in Provincetown. The ship was designed by United States naval architect William Baker and built in the Upham Shipyard in Plymouth, England. The ship is considered a replica with solid oak timbers, tarred hemp rigging, and hand-colored maps, and it's 106 foot long by 25 feet wide, 236-ton displacement. It had 3 masts, a main mast, foremast, and mizzenmast, and a bowsprit and 6 canvas sails. This came with 140 pilgrims and a crew of 21. You can imagine privacy on the Mayflower ship. But seen here was the crew, which was necessary to actually man it to cross the Atlantic Ocean. And seen in the center is Captain Alan Villiers, and he's to the right of the steering wheel. And we also see on the left, second mate Adrian Small. The other members of the crew, actually seen here, posed for a publicity photograph after weeks of sailing on the Atlantic Ocean. But as they arrived in the New World, they dressed in 17th century costumes that sailors would have worn. While they greet thousands of well-wishers on June 13, 1957 at Plymouth, upon their arrival after 55 days at sea on the ratlines to the mizzenmast and stairs to the poop deck. Never had such a worldwide promotion been so popular, and the smiles of these men show their enthusiasm in having taken part in this wonderful project. Well, they did arrive, and who greeted them? Richard Milhous Nixon. Well, he was then Vice President of the United States, and seen here he's surrounded by a few of the crew members and local Plymouth residents, some holding boat oars and dressed in 17th century costumes. They stand on the shallop which the Harvard crew would actually row them to shore. The Mayflower, too, is seen at anchor in the harbor. This was an important feature and brought thousands of people that actually greeted the Mayflower, too. But of course, one person that was there was Henry Hornblower, seen on the left, and he greets Warwick Charlton on the deck of the Mayflower, too, after it arrived in Plymouth Harbor. Warwick Charlton is best known as the promoter of the Project Mayflower and the construction of Mayflower, too, as a commemoration of the wartime cooperation between the United Kingdom and the United States. In this instance, we realize whether it's a boat or a monument or even, basically, a rock, everything commemorated the Pilgrims. But in a chapter in the book that I said, we all give thanks, who do we see but Richard Cardinal Cushing? Now, during the 1950s and 1960s, there was a place in South Boston called Blimstrom's Village. Maybe you remember it. Not only did it serve good food and potent libations, but it also had wonderful entertainment. I remember my uncle actually was a bartender there. So I was 6 or 7 years of age, and we were brought on a Saturday afternoon to say hello to my uncle, and I got my Shirley Temple. 2 cherries, if you please. But in that instance, I was tweaked on the cheek by this horrid man who had a nose the size of a rooster. And when I said to my parents after I left, "Who was that person?" Well, it was Jimmy Durante. As if a 6-year-old would even know who Jimmy Durante was. But it is in my biography. Well, seen here, he actually would host a Thanksgiving dinner for Boston seniors. And not only did he help to serve it, but this was something that Stanley Lindstrom paid out of his own pocket. They had cabs to bring them, cabs to take them home. A wonderful dinner, and of course music and dancing. And Cardinal Cushing was an important person in some ways to realize. He was one of the great ecumenical ministers. His sister was married to a Jewish man. So in some instances, he actually preached tolerance and acceptance of everyone. During that period, Cushing was also involved in what was basically known as the Kennedy Memorial Hospital in Brighton. And seen here in 1956, he holds an uncooked turkey in his hands. But this was for a Thanksgiving party for the patients, which were young children, at the Kennedy Memorial Hospital. The party was actually sponsored by Lou and Lutza Smith, who were friends of Cushing, and they became part of the hospital's extended family, providing financial support and hosting countless parties and entertainments for the children. They owned Rockingham Park, and they were actually quite generous to this hospital. But there was also the children at a Thanksgiving dinner at this horrible thing called the Industrial School for Crippled and Deformed Children. Today it's known as the Cotting School. It's a nicer name. But these poor children basically were educated at the Cotting School, which was then on what was called West, Newbury Street? No, it couldn't have been Newbury Street. But it was just short of Symphony Hall. The school had been founded in 1893 as the nation's first school for children with physical disabilities by Dr. Edward Bradford and Dr. Augustus Thorndike, both orthopedic surgeons at Children's Hospital in Boston. And today it's the Cotting School in Lexington, Massachusetts. But look at the eyes on that child and the size of the turkey leg. Everyone loved it. But even here, Edward Riley of Riley and Company delivered numerous turkeys for Thanksgiving to the Italian Home for Children in Jamaica Plain in 1959. And seen from the left are Sister Mildred Marie, Maureen Halleck, and Peter Andraccio. The Italian Home for Children is located at Center Street and Westchester Road in Jamaica Plain and was incorporated in 1919 as the Home for Italian Children. It was the influenza epidemic of 1918 which orphaned many Italian children from Boston's North End, and the community established this as an orphanage. Wonderful turkeys, and of course it made for a festive holiday. And even Thomas Menino, one-time mayor of the city of Boston, would go to the Pine Street Inn, where he would carve hundreds of turkeys. But he brought his grandchildren that you see in the distance. We do all give thanks, but we also realize how important it is to give back to people that don't necessarily have as much as we do. And we realize that even here, Sean Cardinal O'Malley helps continue that tradition at the Pine Street Inn, here serving soup to the homeless men. We realize in some ways, though many of us are not wealthy, we still have time and kindness to give. That's what Thanksgiving should really represent. It is turkey, it is family, and it is friends, but not all of us have family. We do have friends. But the whole concept here is even children at ABCD in Boston, called Action for Boston Community Development, was a preschool for children before they entered kindergarten. Started in 1966, ABCD would actually have many children from different neighborhoods sit down to learn not only how to write or read, but also here share in a Thanksgiving dinner. They had already made their headbands, and of course we see turkeys, as well as feathers affixed to them, and realize in some ways that though many of these children are not descended from the Pilgrims, they share in that wonderful correlation of what Thanksgiving represents. And here in a school, unnamed, we see the girls having made not only bonnets, but also the wonderful ruffs at their throat, and the little boys' little black hats, which I love those gold buckles, and they're eating their dessert after having shared a lunch. Thanksgiving is something we've become indoctrinated with. It is the thanks of giving for not only a harvest, but also for the life. Many of us realize in some ways that Thanksgiving is truly something that's quite fun. Well, this book, Thanksgiving Traditions in Boston, is a compilation of Bostonian shared traditions and anecdotes. By the mid-20th century, Bostonians, now living in a thriving nexus of ethnic, religious, and racial composition, and far more diverse than the early Pilgrims could ever expected, began to refashion Thanksgiving to include ethnic foods and traditions, which their ancestors brought to the New World. Each group broadened the meaning of Thanksgiving, and food became a way to preserve one's background while assimilating into the Pilgrim culture. And with Richard Cardinal Cushing annually serving turkey dinner to Boston senior citizens at Blimstrom's Village in South Boston, to Sean Cardinal O'Malley, Mayor Raymond Flynn, and Mayor Thomas Menino serving Thanksgiving dinner to the homeless at the Pine Street Inn, Governor Charlie Baker serving dinner for workers at Goodwill Industries, or Mayor Martin Walsh and other elected officials in helping to fill food baskets at the Greater Boston Food Bank, we realize that Thanksgiving, once a decidedly New England holiday in the 19th century, has been embraced by all Americans in the 21st century, and we proudly share in the remembrance of all that bountiful harvest that the Pilgrims celebrated in 1621 with our fellow men. Today, Thanksgiving remains a placid holiday filled with food, football, and parades. Well, happy Thanksgiving, one and all. This is a book that in some ways I've really tried to chronicle in wonderful photographs our shared memories. And in that instance, we realize that it is a holiday, now one of many that we get off from work. Now that I'm retired, I think of Thanksgiving as one of those days, oh, is it that day already? But I think it's actually an important feature to realize that we really truly have so much to give thanks for. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Please.
The comment I had, those pictures of them stepping off of that boat in the snow and ice,
Sure.
and thinking, how in heck did they ever do that?
Well, we were all young once.
Well, we would never do that.
Well, I think in a lot of ways, thank you very much. Oh, boy, that's great.
It just amazes me.
Oh,
They were so courageous.
ma'am, it's $20. Sorry, I've got to feed a cat. But it's true. I mean, oh, thank you. But I think one of the things, no, don't worry. But I think one of the things is, I mean, if you had been on a boat for 3 months, I think you'd probably want to get off too. Please.
You know, I was going to say thank you because my father always told me one of his proudest days
No problem.
was
Thank you.
marching in the Thanksgiving parade when he was like the
Really?
captain. And I didn't really believe it, but he said his mother and his father and his grandmother, and he was marching
Sure.
down in front of the State House. And thank you for
But the thing is, you know, when you think about that parade, it started off in 1929 with men and women that worked at Jordan Marsh. But by the early 1940s, now my father was the class of 39 at Harvard, they actually petitioned young men at schools to actually work for $2 for 7 hours to hold those guide wires. And you can imagine $2, but of course tuition was only $300 in those days. Please. Were there animals on the boat? Yes, there were. There was a cow because it needed to provide milk for the children and adults. There were chickens, and there were pigs. But the whole aspect is, when they finally got to the New World, these actually had to be put into corrals. You know, it was cold. And I think a lot of times, I'm not sure how many of them died, but half of the pilgrims died. But they did. So what? Cats? I bet there might have been a cat or two. You know, Tabby, there might have been a dog. But I think in a lot of ways it's something you can imagine what it was like with all of those people in a boat that was only 103 feet long. Exactly, I know. The smell might have been nice too. Well, I do have a few books, not only on the traditions of Thanksgiving, but the Inferno, because today, November 9th, is the 151st anniversary of the Great Boston Fire of 1872 that destroyed 65 acres in downtown Boston. The books are $20, cash or check. Thank you very much.